For the past few years now, the cool thing to do, the quote unquote smart thing to do, has been to go with the zero running back draft strategy. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why you should do this. There are a bunch of reasons why you shouldn't. I'm going to cover everything into this video, and I'm going to show you exactly how to pull it off at the end if you decided this is the strategy for you in 2024. But first, let's talk about the advantages of this draft strategy and why people prefer it so much. Now, really, let's focus in on the running back position because it's the zero running back draft strategy. Here, the reason people like avoiding running backs in the early rounds is this position has historically a much higher bust rate than what you were going to see with early round wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends. Now, there are a couple different ways that we can go about this and just show it off to you. The easy way is just to look back at drafts last year, right? Where let's cross-reference the highest drafted wide receivers, the highest drafted running backs, and let's look at the guys through the first 36 picks. Now, if you're going to look at wide receivers, you had Jefferson, Chase, Tyreek, Kupp, Diggs, St. Brown, Lamb, A.J. Brown, Wilson, Adams, Waddle, Olave, Smith, Ridley, Higgins, Metcalf, Keenan. Now, if you look at this list, you really only had 4 players out of this list of 17 that were traditional quote-unquote fantasy football bust. You had Jamar Chase busting. The reason being is you had the Joe Burrow injury. Cooper Kupp busted with his own injury. Garrett Wilson, you had the Devontae Adams injury, and you had T. Higgins with the Joe Burrow injury. So what we actually found is at the very top of drafts, really the only thing that we saw last year from the wide receivers who quote-unquote were bust were guys that either got injured themselves or their starting quarterback got injured. So outside of those instances, we were actually very good at identifying which wide receivers were going to have successful seasons in 2023. Now, if you compare this over to the running backs that were drafted inside the first 3 rounds, obviously Christian McCaffrey was a straight up league winner. But after that, Austin Eckler, massive bust. Bijan Robinson, massive bust. Nick Chubb, massive bust. Tony Pollard, massive bust. Josh Jacobs, kind of a bust. Ramondre Stevenson, massive bust. So you have a laundry list of running backs. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, their quarterback got injured or, oh, they got injured. Because if you look at a player like Austin Eckler, Justin Herbert was fine. It's not like Eckler has a major injury he can blame his season on. It's not like Bijan Robinson has a major injury he can blame his season on. I mean, Tony Pollard, the Dallas Cowboys were the number 1 highest scoring offense in the NFL last year. Pollard stayed healthy and was still a massive bust in round 1. You go over to the quarterbacks that were drafted inside the first 3 rounds. Patrick Mahomes was a bust. The tight ends drafted inside the first 3 rounds. Darren Waller was a bust. But outside of that, everybody else smashed. So just looking at a very small sample last year, you can see, oh, okay, yeah. Running backs at the top of drafts actually have a much higher bust rate than what you have with other positions. And if a wide receiver is going to bust, really the only way that happens is with an injury, either to himself or his starting quarterback. You go over and you look at the actual top 12 finishers at running back and wide receiver over the past 2 years. You had, a ton of running backs inside the top 12 this past season that were not selected inside the first 5 rounds of drafts. Kyron Williams was a waiver wire pickup. Alvin Kamara had an ADP of 73. Raheem Mostert, ADP of 138. Devon Achane, ADP of 117. All 4 of them were running back once. However, you go over to wide receiver, really you only had Puka Nacua as a waiver wire pickup. You had Nico Collins as a late round guy. You had Mike Evans as a middle round guy. But honestly, last year for wide receiver was actually by far and away the best season ever in terms of late round guys turning into real wide receiver ones like Puka Nacua. Usually that doesn't happen. What's actually funny is if we go back to 2022, you'll still see the same thing. You have running backs finishing at the top that were drafted late, such as Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, none of whom were drafted inside the first 5 rounds. Whereas at wide receiver, really the only guy that finishes inside the top 12 that was not a top 5 round pick was DeAndre Hopkins, and he only played 9 games. So you can make an argument that he doesn't even belong here either. So that is typically one of the reasons why people will like the zero running back draft strategy. They will go through, they will look at the bust rate at the very top of running back. They'll also identify the fact that some of these late round running backs are going to crush every single season, and it is just significantly harder to project running backs from a season-long perspective. Now, on the flip side of this, what's actually really funny is from a week-to-week perspective, it's actually very easy to project running backs, and it's very difficult to project wide receivers. If we go and look at wide receiver 3s from this past year, You go and look at guys that are going to have massive spike weeks where they're going to give you 80 yards and a receiving touchdown, and they're going to do nothing the next week. I mean, there are a lot of guys that will go and have that one big week where everybody rushes to pick him up off the waiver wire, and then you don't know if you can start him the next week at wide receiver, because wide receiver from a week-to-week perspective is extremely volatile. However, at running back, that may not be the case, because at running back, it's very easy to know if you can start a running back going into the week. Hypothetically, every once in a while, yes, Aaron Jones will go down with an injury. Austin Eckler will go down with an injury. And I'm sitting here screaming, oh my gosh, start A.J. Dillon, start Joshua Kelly, and it doesn't work out. Now, yes, that will happen every once in a while, of course. But a more common thing is what happens when these running backs go down that are starters in their offenses. It's very easy to pick up their backup off the waiver wire and very comfortably put them into your starting lineup if they project to see 70% of the snaps. So it's very easy to not only find running back production off of waivers, but know when to put that running back in your lineup. Whereas at wide receiver, even if you find the production off the waiver wire, it's going to be very difficult to predict who to start. So a lot of people love taking those wide receivers to the very top, the studs in your draft, plugging and playing them every single week, and then just going through and cycling through the running backs until you try to find the next Kyren Williams, or worst case scenario, you're picking up backup to backup each week that has a very projectable role and you can put them in your lineup. Now, I would not advise you to do the zero running back draft strategy in every format. There's specific formats where I think it makes sense in. Obviously, one of those would be Underdog Fantasy, just because when we're drafting on Underdog, the running back values that you get in round 7, 8, 9, 10 are insane. Like every time I'm streaming an Underdog draft, we have someone coming into the live stream going, why did Aaron Jones just fall to round 8? Why did Joe Mixon just go in round 6? And we have to explain, okay, it's Underdog. Running backs are going to be great values later. And yeah, we're going to keep on drafting every single night on the live stream. So of course, if you want to hop in one of those drafts with us, you can find that link in the description, in the comment section, in the live chat. If you use code FLOCK, you can get a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. You can get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, my 2024 fantasy football rankings, my 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet, all of which are updated every Sunday till the season starts for you. And also, you're going to get a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1 if you use code FLOCK. My favorite place to draft, no time commitment during the year. It's how I draft hundreds of teams every season, how I won 150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. But outside of Underdog Fantasy, in your regular redraft league, where it potentially makes sense for you to go through and for you to implement the zero running back draft strategy, one, we need to check in with the scoring. It needs to be a full PPR format. We went through and I dove into all the in-depth numbers for you. You can see them on the screen here, where it comes to the percentage of your starting lineup output that's going to be accounted for by wide receiver versus running back in full PPR leagues versus non-PPR leagues. And the same thing, you can see the amount of flex-worthy players that are going to come into play every week at wide receiver versus running back in a full PPR versus non-PPR league. Running back is king in non-PPR. Wide receiver is king in full PPR. If you're playing in a half PPR, obviously, it's a very balanced format and draw the line between the two. So you want to be going zero RB. If it's a full PPR league, I would not advise this at all in a non-PPR format. You want to be going zero RB specifically if you can start 4 or more wide receivers. Because the issue that you may find yourself in is if you decide to go with zero RB and you go, you know what? I'm going to draft 3 wide receivers in a row in my draft this year. And your starting lineup requirements only include 2 wide receivers and 1 flex. You may get your 3 wide receivers. You may go Justin Jefferson, Marvin Harrison, and then Nico Collins, and absolutely love your wide receiver room. You have that room filled out. You have your flex spot filled out. And then all of a sudden in round 4, you're looking at Devonta Smith and going, oh my gosh, I really want to take Smith, but I really need a running back. So I guess I'm going to have to reach on Alvin Kamara here instead. And you put yourself in a position where you really can't take advantage of the values in the middle rounds. So what I'm looking for with that zero RB build is if it's a league where you have multiple flex spots, if it's a league where you start 3 or more wide receivers, or preferably if you can start 5 or more receivers, such as like a 3 wide receiver starting lineup requirement plus 2 flex spots and a PPR format, that is the exact spot that you want to be going zero running back, because there you can draft 5 wide receivers early, and every guy that you take should project out to be in your starting lineup. So even if you take those 3 guys at the very top that you like, and you have wide receiver values that you want to take advantage of in the middle rounds, you're still able to do that because you're not just sending those guys straight to your bench and wasting picks on guys that may not make an impact. So those are the lineups that we need to be targeting zero running back builds with. PPR, where you can start 4 or more receivers. The zero RB build in my mind is going to be very difficult to pull off if it's a half PPR, non-PPR, and you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex. Now, the strategy behind it after you implement this, when you go wide receiver early, I really want to also take an elite level quarterback. I really also want to take an elite level tight ends, one or the other, preferably both. To go 5 wide receivers straight and then not allow yourself to get the Josh Allen, the Jalen Hurts level QB, you're leaving so many points on the table to just go through and take another marginal wide receiver. Whereas if you were to say go like 2 receivers and Josh Allen, then 2 more wide receivers, or maybe you go 3 receivers, Lamar Jackson, then Mark Andrews, you could be elite at quarterback and tight end and allow yourself to roster as many running backs as you can late. That's the advantage that you're going to get from an elite level quarterback or an elite level tight end with these zero RB builds is once we get to the later rounds, the number one priority that you have is to roster as many running backs as freaking possible in those late rounds, trying to hit on the next Raheem Mostert, trying to hit on the next Karen Williams. Now, of course, I am not going to sit here and go, I know 100% for a fact that this is the next Raheem Mostert. But what we can do is from a strategy perspective, you can take 6 of those guys that you think have a shot. And then all of a sudden, if you hit on one of them and you're able to attach that top 5 running back to the best wide receiver room in the league with hopefully an elite quarterback and an elite tight end, that's how you win the league, is by rostering as many running backs that you can at the end of the draft, chasing those high upside guys, being fluid and making moves on the waiver wire early on in the season, and banking the projectable easy volume at wide receiver at the very top and unlocking extra roster spots where you don't have to have a backup quarterback if you're able to get an elite quarterback like Lamar or Mahomes. Now, I think that should be it. I definitely want to dive into a mock draft for y'all here. This mock draft is going to be 3 wide receivers, 2 flex, and I really just want to illustrate this is where you would go zero RB. And if you were to, this is how you would approach it. Here we are. We're going to go ahead, get this thing started. We are going to be at pick 6. If you were going to go zero running back this year, I think this is about the pick range that you want to be doing it at. The reason being is you're going to have McCaffrey already off the board, and you will still have the access to an elite level wide receiver here in round 1, whether that's going to be CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, St. Brown. Don't necessarily know just yet. We're going to figure it out in literally 1 second. Now, of course, if you were playing in a league that instead you only started 2 wide receivers, 1 flex, I would not recommend going with the wide receiver here in round 1. Instead, I would recommend going with Breece or Bijan, but specifically in a full PPR format where we're playing with the ability to start 4 or 5 wide receivers, there I think you can take one. I am actually ranking Amon-Ra St. Brown over Justin Jefferson in my own rankings this year. So, of course, if you were just drafting off sleeper ADP, there you would go Jefferson. But if you look at the ADP consensus cheat sheet, if you look at my rankings, I think St. Brown's probably the guy. So there are a couple different guys you could go with here at wide receiver. I think we're most likely going to go in the direction of, I think Collins would be the pick if there was no chance that he made it back to us in round 3. I think you could also consider Waddle. I think you could also consider Deebo Samuel. But because all 3 of those wide receivers, if you look at the ADP consensus cheat sheet, could make it to us to the 306, we will just take the wide receiver that has no shot to make it to us in the 3rd round in Davante Adams, even if I do have him ranked behind Collins, behind Waddle, but they are pretty much in the same tier. Okay, now that we're back up on the clock, looking at the board that's available to us right now, the best wide receiver would either be Cooper Kupp, Malik Neighbors, DJ Moore. For the purpose of this video, and because it's a league where we can start up to 5 wide receivers, we are going to go with Cooper Kupp here at the 306. However, if you look at my rankings would have you drafting Josh Jacobs. And I do want to reiterate, the only reason you would go wide receiver here in this round is if you were playing in that format where we can start like 5 of these guys on week-to-week perspective, and it's a full PPR league. Okay, now that we're coming back up on the clock, it's really going to come down to, are we wanting to get that elite level quarterback Really, the only guy I'd be looking at this range would be Lamar if you were to fall to us. If we wanted to continue to go wide receiver, the best available receivers would be Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, and really that's about it if you're looking at the top of the board. And then we have the option to go with an elite level tight end. What we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead. We are going to take Lamar Jackson at the 407. I do want to reiterate, this is a league where we can start 3 receivers, 2 flexes. We have those 3 wide receiver slots filled out. Grabbing the elite level quarterback does put us in a spot where now we could kind of focus in on the flex spots if we were going to fill those. But Lamar does give us the ability to go with an elite tight end in Andrews at the 506 as well. Sadly, Andrews and Zay Jones both are off the board by the time that we're back on. Now, we can have the ability to continue to take wide receiver here. We could go with our first running back. My favorite running back in this range would be Kenneth Walker. If we're looking at wide receiver, you're really choosing between George Pickens, Keenan Allen, Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin. Tight end, you have the option to go George Kittle. It would have been just beautiful if Mark Andrews would have fallen to us. We'll be boring here. We will take George Pickens to the 506 and really see if we can struggle it out at running back later. On the clock here in the middle of the 6th, what's nice about going 0 running back with this format in particular is if we were to take another wide receiver, this would still be someone that slides into our lineup and should provide us with a positive expected points per game mark early on in the season. Now, if we're looking at the best available receivers, according to the ADP consensus cheat sheet, there'd either be Godwin, Worthy, Ridley. The best available running backs would most likely be David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift. I think that we're going to go ahead. We're really going to push the envelope. We are going to go Chris Godwin and see if we can survive the later rounds. Now, this is about the portion of the draft where we do need to pivot over. We need to make sure we're getting running backs. Any additional wide receivers that we select here would immediately be going down to our bench, even in week 1. Going over to tight end, looking at Bowers and Njoku Ferguson is the best options. I think we've already missed the tier of guys that would be exciting here in the middle rounds. So instead, I think we'll pivot over to running back. We'll grab Aaron Jones as our running back 1. What is nice about Jones is it's a very safe role to project out week 1. We know we really need to be winning on running back off the waiver wire in this league, but grabbing Aaron Jones at the 706 does at least give us a player that we can rely upon at the beginning of the year. Now we're going to be back up on the clock here. This is about a range where if we're looking at these running backs, I think these guys like Nick Chubb, Jonathan Brooks would actually be quality picks if you were thinking about late season upside, but specifically because we go with the 0 RB build here, those will be guys that we're most likely not wanting to target. We need somebody that we can start early on. So what I think we're actually going to do is we're going to take Tony Pollard. Now, this is weird because if you look at my rankings, if you look at the ADP consensus cheat sheet, it may tell you that instead you want to go ahead and you want to take Jaylen Warren as the best available running back. But specifically looking at the ADP for where we are drafting, it looks like there's a shot that Jaylen Warren makes it back to us in round 9, whereas we would have no chance that Pollard does. Okay, so our plan to get Jaylen Warren in the round 9 clearly did not work out. Looks like we're probably drafting with people who know what they're doing. So instead, now if we're looking at running back, best available guys are going to be Brian Robinson, Trey Benson, Devin Singletary, Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb. A quarterback, we're not taking another once we have Lamar. Going over to wide receiver, this range of wide receivers is pretty gross. We can't pivot over and actually take a tight end if we would like. I know that most people have Bowers over David Njoku. Personally, I prefer Njoku. We're going to go ahead. We're going to get him at the 906. And what taking Njoku here allows is I believe that we're only going to have to take one tight end when we draft Njoku. I'm going to feel comfortable to start him regardless of the matchup. And if we end up being wrong in this, we'll be able to hit the waiver wire for tight end. But it should allow us to be able to roster a ton of running backs down here on the bench. Okay, coming back up, since we have Lamar and David Njoku, and we're really trying to roster as many running backs as possible, probably not looking at quarterback or tight end with this next selection. Instead, almost exclusively going to be looking at running back, wide receiver. Now, I would love if we have Chase Brown making it to us. Now, personally, I'm not the biggest Chase Brown fan. I don't think that he's a great talent. But I do think it's a phenomenal situation where right now it looks like it's anybody's job between Moss and Brown. And what we need here is we're just taking 1,000 different shots at these running backs and ambiguous backfields, hoping that one of them steps into the role. And all of a sudden we have a monstrous team paired up with our top end receivers. Okay, on the clock again, this is another spot where I think we can honestly just kind of continue to hammer in running back if we really wanted to. Wide receiver, best available are Mike Williams, Shaheed, Josh Downs, Gabe Davis, Troy Franklin. Whereas at running back, there are a lot of these guys that we don't really know what their roles are going to be this next year. If you look at my rankings right now, a player that's moving up in a big time way is Rico Dowdle. But the thing is, if you look at the way that ADP is set up, where Rico Dowdle has an ADP of 145, I actually think that we should be able to get him on the way back around in the 12th. So we're going to take Charbonnet here in the 11th and see if we can get Dowdle in the 12th, but just again, taking as many running backs in the later rounds as we can. Okay, we are back up on the clock. We are discussing the ability to get Rico Dowdle on the way back around, which is exactly what we're going to do here, right? If you look at this running back room overall, I have no idea if these guys are going to be good. Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, Chase Brown, Zach Charbonnet. There's a lot of uncertainty, but what I do know is I can pretty comfortably go through and early in the year start Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, and then look for the upside cases of Chase Brown, Zach Charbonnet, Rico Dowdle, these running backs that have uncertain workloads that are in good offenses. And then if they don't hit for the upside, we always have the back door where we could potentially hit off someone on waivers. Okay, here we really have the flexibility to do anything, right? We can continue to find running back upside pieces, but if we are looking, it's dried up. Maybe Ty Chandler would be the best guy in this range. Whereas if we go over to wide receiver, wide receiver does seem a little dry as well. Maybe the best guy that you'd be looking at here would be someone like Brandon Cooks. So instead, what I think we actually pivot over to, because we didn't take the true elite level tight end at the top, I'm not going to be too upset about taking Cole Kmet here in the 13th and just essentially locking up tight end production this next season. Because if I look at a lot of these wide receivers, such as like Adam Thielen, Quentin Johnston, a lot of the running backs, such as Condre Miller, Ty Chandler, Antonio Gibson, a lot of these players do seem like waiver wire options anyway. Yeah, here in our final two rounds, we are just going to go ahead. We're going to be boring. We're going to take a defense. We are going to take a kicker. If we are looking at some of these matchups right now, Tampa actually gets Washington week 1, which isn't bad. You have Atlanta for Pittsburgh. Miami's going to be going up against Jacksonville. Washington's going to be going up against Tampa. Philly's going up against Green Bay. So I honestly think we probably go with the Tampa defense just for the week 1 matchup. But obviously, these last two guys, we are streaming every week. Now, I have no idea what to do with kicker. We're going to take Jake Moody. I don't know. You do you. But if we're looking at this team overall, I think it's a very good example of what you would be looking for in a 0 running back build. We have our elite level quarterback. We have wide receivers that are very safe with projections through the course of the season. At the top with St. Brown, Adams, Kupp, Pickens, Godwin. This is a league where we can start up to 5 wide receivers from a week-to-week perspective, so we can get all these guys in there week 1, week 2, week 3. We also have running backs that have projectable workloads at the beginning of the season, such as Aaron Jones and Tony Pollard. Now, obviously, we're not very excited about these running backs because we did sacrifice the early round guys, but then we rostered a decent amount of running backs down there on the bench that potentially have the upside to take jobs in very good offenses if things were to break their way. But obviously, with the 0 RB build, you are really just looking to go through and you are trying to hit the waiver wire early and often, trying to find the next Kyron. Now, thank you again for hanging out with us this video. I do want to remind y'all, 0 running back is a viable draft strategy in full PPR formats when you can start 4 or more wide receivers. If you are going to go this route, I would definitely recommend getting an elite quarterback or an elite tight end, possibly both, and roster as many running backs as you possibly can later on. However, do not use this draft strategy if you are in a league where you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex. Because there, if you hammer elite wide receivers at the very top and you don't decide to take a single running back, it's going to really limit your ability to take value wide receiver in the middle rounds, which looking at a lot of ADP draft boards right now, whether it's ESPN, Yahoo, it doesn't matter. It does currently look like it is very much advantageous to be going with wide receivers through the middle rounds. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you. Really hope that you got something from this video. I do want to remind y'all that we are coming up on the Flock Meetup, August 22nd, Austin, Texas. If you're in San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Austin, I better see you there. You can grab a ticket at flockfantasy.store. And of course, if you want to draft with us in the live stream, we are drafting every single night. You can find that link in the description, comment section, live chat. If you use code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy, you will get my 2024 rankings, draft guide, and ADP cheat sheet, all of which will be updated every Sunday till the start of the season for you. And also, if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $250 and a Christian McCaffrey special pick of more than less than half a total yard. By far and away my favorite place to draft. how we have hundreds of teams every year, and that's how we won 150,000 2 years ago, just in case you haven't heard me say it a million times. But appreciate you. Really hope you had a great day, and really hope I get to see you out in the live stream later.